This podcast is brought to you by Spirits and Distilling for those who make and drink great spirits. Join our free email newsletter for technical and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Learn more at spiritsanddistilling.com.
Hello and welcome to the Craft Spirits and Distillers podcast. I'm your host, Molly Troupe, and today with me is Morgan McLachlan, co-founder of AMASS, a spirits producer, and Dissoy, which is a non-alcoholic beverage company. Her expertise lies with all things botanical, as you may be able to tell by her Instagram handle, Ginwitch. Morgan, thank you for joining us today. Before we dive in, G&D Chillers understands that each distillery's chilling requirements are unique. On every distillery project, G&D offers the front-end design and engineering that your team needs at no cost to you. Jim Kerr, VP of Manufacturing at Red Boot Beverages, says, G&D has been there since the early days. Their knowledgeable engineers and service techs are there when we need them. We're in the midst of a large expansion, and they have been right there with us to select chiller solutions for today and the future. Reach out today for a quote at gdchillers.com.
Morgan, I'd love to just kick this off with you telling me how you got started in the spirits industry.
That's always an interesting question, isn't it? Because most children don't say, I want to make booze when I grow up. So my distilling career, this is actually my second career. My first career, I was in film and television production. I worked as a camera woman. And I actually did that for 10 years before taking an interest in distilling. So, very different field, but when you think about it, or at least for me, there are a lot of similarities in that with camera and distilling, it's both very much technical, and there actually is quite a bit of like science involved if you want to get into it, into camera and certainly mechanical, but then there's also artistry involved, and there is also tradition, and sort of stylistic traditions certainly as well. So there was quite a bit of crossover. So there is that aspect, and then for me, sort of the sort of passion part of it, and I do really like the technical aspect, was for me in particular as a distiller was my interest in botany. And as we've discussed, we both grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in a just absolutely phenomenal part of the world for nature, and always had sort of a deep appreciation for botany and the natural world, growing up in British Columbia. So up there, I was always foraging, could name, most of the plants in my environment. And then about 20 years ago, I moved to Southern California. I moved to Los Angeles. Ironically, when I moved to Los Angeles, I got out of the film business. And so after I moved here I found myself in a completely different climate and ecosystem, and took it upon myself to start learning about, the natural world around me here in Southern California. So I was doing a lot of foraging down here, and learning about the environment. I also happened to marry into an agricultural family. So this is my now ex-husband, came from a big California ranching family. So had access to a lot of agricultural products, particularly fruit, because, that's what we grow here in Southern California. And then from there, I don't really know what overcame me, but thought that would be interesting to learn how to distill and ferment, obviously, too. My education is more in what would probably be considered cultural anthropology. And my interest sort of as a hobby in alcohol and beverage alcohol really came from when I was in college. I was living in Eastern Europe, working on a cultural history of the Czech Republic with a professor. And there they have all these incredible, particularly like schnapps and brandies, slivovitz, etc. And obviously, Czech is sort of known for its absinthe, but that's another story. So I also became interested in alcohol as a cultural product, actually through academia, which is kind of another weird way to get into it. With sort of the thesis that beverages and, alcoholic beverages in general are very culturally specific and also important, like culturally, and historically quite regional, and usually emerged historically from certain regions for ecological, is usually what would grew in the environment. But, the traditions around drinking are very important to people's cultures. So it kind of came together through a number of different interests. And, candidly, I, from there, built a little still and started distilling in my East Hollywood bathtub, really for fun. It's a true story. Don't tell on me. And it just kind of went from there. And it was just this really fun thing. It was like, before that, I'd taken photography in high school, and it was kind of like being in like a darkroom lab. It was very like meditative and just really still kind of magical about what happens in the fermentation and distillation process. And just kind of fell in love with it that way.
So take me back to this bathtub.
Mm-hmm.
What did you start out distilling?
The very first thing I ever distilled was an eau-de-vie made from clementines.
Yum.
It was really good. And, well, it wasn't that good as a distillate. It was kind of a little janky, but that was the first thing. And so my focus then and always has been working with local ingredients. This really is in distilling. So my specialties more are in the sort of like the brandies, the fruit distillates, and then anything that touches botanicals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so not a lot of whiskey is what I'm trying to say.
Not a lot of whiskey. Yeah, that's okay. This is a safe place to not talk about whiskey too.
I love I love whiskey, but I just decided to kind of keep things focused. So that really has been my focus this whole time, which has been 18 years now, which is kind of bananas.
So let's talk more about this eau de clementine. And just kind of your creative process. We're all inherently creative, and we find inspiration in sometimes the strangest ways. With that kind of project, what was your thought process on it? Why did you decide to ferment and then distill clementines?
Again, a number of reasons. I think one of them was I also studied permaculture. So I'm very interested in working with the natural, really local materials. And so, of course, here in Southern California, we are known for our citrus. So wanted to see if it could be done. At that time, I certainly don't know of anyone distilling citrus. So kind of thought, well, it probably can't be done. Like maybe the fruit is too acidic, or, it's not, citrus oils aren't friendly towards fermentation. But in fact, clementines ferment beautifully. And so it was kind of just like well, what would, if Southern California had a regional spirit, what would it be? And I thought it would probably be a distillate from citrus. And so it kind of started there. And I guess just sort of like a what if kind of question. In terms of like creative process, that's a funny one. I should say that I actually come from a family of artists. So that is one thing I learned from my family. Business, not so much. I'll say, but having an actual creative process and a structure around it was something that I learned from my family. And, for example, my grandfather is a visual artist, and sort of just kind of seeing that progression from an idea to an experimentation, to an idea to like kind of a thesis to experimentation, and then, watching a project evolve. And the patience really that is required, and the commitment that's required through that. And also, I would say kind of like the faith that's required sometimes through the creative process. I got from him.
It's so interesting to think of it as like a faith thing, like faith in yourself, faith on your materials. Let's talk about that a little bit more.
I think I'm probably, there's a lot, there are, I love the technical aspects of distilling, but for me, the creative thing, it really is quite intuitive. And I am a bit of a California hippie princess in that, like, I do think that intuition, like things that we create aren't from us anyways. Maybe they're from something else. So the best things that I've made have really come from sort of getting into a flow state and trusting my gut. That said, that process, if there's anything if there's any bit of advice I could give to baby distillers, it's take impeccable notes and take your time and record everything. Because in my early days, I would make things and I'd be like, well, this is like tastes amazing and it's mind blowing. And I actually don't know. I can't remember everything that I did to create this. So I'm very much a fan of intuition. That said, so I usually kind of do things intuitively. Obviously there's sort of traditions, particularly stylistic traditions, and obviously there's sort of tried and true techniques, but I trust my instincts on experimentation, and then afterwards I always kind of look to validate them through chemistry, for example. So the other thing for me too, in terms of inspiration, is I think sometimes, especially something that is so tradition driven, if you're just kind of looking within the category for inspiration, I look outside of categories. So I do a lot of fragrance as well, and that has been a tremendous, I'll say, source of inspiration, but then also just like technically speaking, okay, let's borrow some techniques from perfumery. Okay, well, that works. Okay, well, thinking about a gin in terms of base notes and middle notes and top notes, thinking about, fragrance accords and like how those work in harmony, and then thinking about, okay, well, how can I apply those principles into, say, an NA beverage? So for me, I also look at techniques from other, I'll say, mediums, and that can sometimes be a source of inspiration as well.
I love all of that, as you might do too. I'm a little bit of a fan of fragrance. I think, especially when you work with botanicals so closely, it's just a natural tangent to find yourself on. As you mentioned, there's a lot of different sources of information when it comes to fragrance that can be really helpful. Is there a particular reference guide for perfume that has really spoken to you?
There's a few books, but it's actually funny. I don't have any of the big, there's a few big textbooks, and I actually don't own any of them. There's a few great books, like the books by Jean-Claude Elena, who's the perfumer at AMASS forever. There's one called Listening to Scent. Now, these aren't particularly technical books. And then, a lot of this information is just available online. I'm trying to think. I also haven't read any fragrance books probably in about 4 years at this point, but there's actually there's a lot. That whole world, that whole community is just like a community of really passionate people. So I'm on a lot of forums as well. But even just like learning about like different traditional fragrance styles, for example, and sort of like the formalism around fragrance is really informative, at least for someone who works with obviously a lot of botanicals. The other thing that has been very sort of, I'll say, validating in a lot of the work that I do is learning about like sort of like more of the food science, like molecular gastronomy, understanding of flavors. So
For our listeners who don't know what that is, you want to dive in?
molecular gastronomy. Okay, so it's the study of molecules as they relate to the chemical and physical processes of cooking.
So you can kind of think of like using a rotary evaporator in the kitchen and like different ways to mimic a taste, but like removing the texture.
Yeah, or for example, like looking at, like the chemistry of the actual like flavor compounds that are found in foods and thinking, okay, well, why do these flavors pair so well together? I mean, the flavor Bible is another, one that I know even a lot of bartenders use, for example, and that's sort of like looking at, okay, well, what are classic flavor combinations? Well, why do those flavor combinations actually work well together? And thinking about it, like deconstructing it that way. But in a lot of cases, for me with molecular gastronomy, it is more like, okay, like there's this, what are the main terpenes that are in a Seville orange? And what are those terpenes and those flavor molecules? What do those flavor molecules, what other plant materials do those flavor molecules also show up in? What of those flavor molecules can actually, when they're heated, transform into, I'll say, for example, like a creamier version of themselves. So it is really breaking down flavors into like their molecular chemistry and learning that language a little bit. I'm not gonna say, like, I am not a food scientist. I basically have a fine arts degree, but looking at those flavors and kind of understanding them from a molecular level can kind of help you, number one, think about flavor combinations and what can complement each other, and then also like processes to get like a certain type of flavor out of a certain type of distillate or distilling material. And so it's just sort of another, I don't know, that's just like a big source of, I'll sometimes go to sort of like the flavor Bible, or just kind of like then kind of look at like a plant that I'm working with and think, okay, well, what is in here that is actually really compelling or interesting, or what is the makeup of bergamot, and like why is that interesting, and why does it work so well with complemented by tannic notes?
But I think too, like combining a little bit all these topics, gin, botanicals, perfume. I mean, you have another entire adventure as well in the non-alcoholic space, which is just an interesting place to take botanicals and approaching it in a perfume manner.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So
I just want to kind of talk about taking botanicals, which you obviously love, and then using a different medium like water to get the flavor that you want for an entirely different space.
Molly, I'm just going to tell you, making non-alc is such a pain in the ass. So I do, so I have two companies, AMASS, which we're really known for, I would say mostly our gin at AMASS, and then at Dessois, I would say we're probably one of the leaders in the category. We've been in the market since we launched in 2022. I first came up with the idea for Dessois in 2019, so it was a lot of time in development, albeit there was a pandemic and a baby involved, but taking, techniques and principles from distilling and moving that into an NA RTD was a bit of a challenge because, number one, very different beverage format. Number two, alcohol is, as it turns out, alcohol is an excellent solvent. So it's very good at extracting flavors. And then NA is just such a funny category because it's so new and people's consumer expectations are kind of all over the map. So with that line of products, which is a non-alcoholic sparkling line of non-alcoholic sparkling aperitifs, there was all sorts of things that I was pulling from. I mean, because we kind of kept the focus on aperitifs, I've made a lot of vermouths, I've made a lot of aperitifs in the past. Obviously, there's a long history of aperitifs. So, using a lot of the same botanicals that are traditionally found in aperitifs. But then you sort of have this added challenge of like really trying to get that flavor in there. And then trying to create a beverage, which is, technically speaking, I mean, de Soie is composed of water, mostly water, juices, teas, sometimes incorporating a little vinegar, different types of vinegar to get some of the like acetic notes that you kind of get in the byproduct of fermentation, and then botanical extracts. And then really to try to kind of mimic the alcohol experience, and, create a beverage that is sophisticated and nuanced, and it has layers, and it has a nose, and it has like a great mouthfeel, and like, an interesting finish. So it's a bit of a flavor in your mouth. So that's been a really fun and challenging project that has been going on for a long time now. But I in the case of de Soie, for example, kind of figured out pretty quickly that I needed to source and work with botanical extracts, that are natural and composed of, sometimes they're CO2 extracts, sometimes, the extracts, sometimes they're extracted in a tiny bit of alcohol. Sometimes they're glycerin extracts. But it is quite challenging. But it's a fun challenge.
I think it would be really fun to kind of dive into why you have to kind of go that approach when you're trying to craft something in the NA world.
Well, there's a number of technical reasons, to be honest. Like, left to my own devices, I would, make my own extracts, for example, or, I do actually make, AMASS has a non-alcoholic product called Riverine, and that is a hydrosol. We are actually distilling, but distilling from a water base versus alcohol is incredibly inefficient, and you actually don't necessarily get the best flavors from the same botanicals in water, like distilled with water. Don't necessarily extract the same compounds that you would expect to get in alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, like quite just like candidly, for anyone who's, it's not, moving from a distillery to FDA food and beverage co-packing environment. There's just also for food safety reasons, honestly, they're not open to making like chamomile. Like, I have done this, but like, it's just, there's a lot of opportunity for microbial issues if you're making a lot of extracts and infusions yourself. So food safety is actually just like a massive reason in and of itself to work with third-party extract producers who this is all they do and their products are food safe and they come with COAs, as opposed to me and my cauldron, making a dandelion extract. There's just a lot of opportunity for pathogens there.
Right. And when you're getting these extracts too, like leading into the dandelions, that they're not harvested by someone on the side of a highway with who knows what.
well, sourcing's a whole other, that's a whole other fun thing. So yeah, there's a lot to it really. But and there is also just sort of like product consistency too. When you're producing at a scale like that, and just having to, not take those extra steps. I mean, that said, like I think the cool thing that's happened in the last 5 years is that, flavor companies are kind of realizing the consumer demand for simpler, less modified, kind of like clean label, like literal botanical extracts, as opposed to what is generally referred to as natural flavors, which are natural, but much more processed. You're getting into the actual molecular chemistry of like those flavor profiles and the extraction process, as opposed to like a what is effectively like a tincture.
So working in different mediums, working with lots of different botanicals leads to lots of different surprises. Is there any particular ingredient that you can think back that has really shocked you the most?
That shocked me. Yeah, like the outcome. Well, I think that there are some, like I don't own my own distillery at the moment. I don't have my own gear. When I did, I had a hybrid pot still that had, I was producing gins, for example, where we're doing macerations and sometimes rectifying that distillate a little bit before passing it over to the botanical basket. But the interesting thing, like botanicals that have surprised me the most are ingredient. Well, here's one actually. So I did make a vodka out of clementines. This is interesting. I did make a vodka out of clementines, and I thought I was being really cheeky. I called it vapid vodka, and then people would ask what vapid meant, and I thought maybe I shouldn't be in marketing, but vapid vodka was distilled from clementines, and you would think that it would have sort of like an orange cleaning fluid kind of quality from the citrus oils. In fact, in the esterification process, these beautiful vanilla creamy notes came out. So it actually made an incredible vodka, and the mouthfeel was amazing. Like it had this really nice, full, chewy, creamy mouthfeel. But, would I have expected to get notes of vanilla from a citrus distillate? No. So that's an example of one where it's just like, okay, well, you don't know what you're going to get. It was sort of like a happy accident, I guess. But it really had obviously, well, they changed the rules recently, but vodka is supposed to be by definition odorless and tasteless. But it did have like these very faint notes of I would say almost like orange blossom and then vanilla in it. And it was just so delicious. Another one, I think like terpenes in general, like seeing what happens to terpenes in distillation is interesting. And, certain botanicals, like there's certain aromas and esters that are just like much more volatile. So one of the things I love the flavor of are, different types of sages. And, I've done a lot of work with sage, various sages. And I developed this gin and had done a multiple distillations, and then added a bit of sage and thought, okay, well, this is it. Like, this is sort of what I was looking for. And it actually, as it was distilling, the distillery really had like it was pretty dank. Like it smelled like marijuana and it smelled like cannabis in the distillery. So those same terpenes were really coming out from the sage. But then those notes would just sort of just as the spirit rested for like a couple weeks, would just really settle down. I don't know. I mean, have you had this experience with botanicals?
Oh yeah, like there's just that like resting period where you wait to see that they're behaving. And I have like, my botanicals that are some of my favorites that I have to tactfully not put into different recipes because, you're trying to make different spirits. And one of those for me is cardamom.
Oh, yeah.
And cardamom is it's such a nice layer,
Yeah.
but it will take over.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take much to do that.
No.
And so I'm always kind of waiting to see if that cardamom note, if I'm putting something, is going to peek through a little too much, or if it's going to play nicely with its friends.
Yeah, and cardamom's interesting because it's a pretty long chain flavor molecule. So there's a lot for cardamom to kind of connect with, I would say, in the matrix of flavor chemicals. And I'm a big fan. AMASS has a lot of cardamom in it, but AMASS is also just a big, lush, dank gin that has a lot. It has 29 botanicals, and it has a lot of other. I would say it's complemented by a bunch of other long chain flavor molecule ingredients as well. And so I always kind of talk about those 3 botanicals as kind of being the tent poles of the botanical matrix, and connecting all of the flavors from there. But yeah, cardamom can, you can end up tasting very soapy. It can really sit on top of other flavors in an unfair way. It's kind of that, it can be kind of it's a bit of a diva.
Yes.
But it's really beautiful, and it's just finding being able to balance it out. It's a little bit more of a challenging botanical in that respect.
Absolutely. And I have crafted gins that have 7 botanicals that they've been fine, and then 19 botanicals. I think that there is no right number of botanicals to include in a gin. It's all up to whoever's making it. I'd love to dive into that creative process of putting 29 botanicals in, because it's a lot of layers, and you did it for a reason.
Yeah. It wasn't gratuitous, and it was a big pain in the ass. Well, look, this is the funny thing, and you've been out in market, and for the most part, people find that really interesting. But can you taste all of those individual botanicals? This isn't a lavender lemonade, okay? There's a lot going on there. But those 29 botanicals were really the result of taking more of this molecular gastronomy and more of this, principles from perfumery. And, perfumes don't have 10 perfume ingredients in them. They tend to have much more. And when you look at how perfumes are composed, they're often composed of aromas from similar parts of the aroma wheel, where you're kind of building a more complex or unique aroma from that particular spectrum of the aroma or flavor wheel. So that's really what I was doing with AMASS. And the thing with AMASS, the challenge there was I wanted to make a unique gin, but I also wanted it to be versatile. So for this particular gin, there's so many amazing novel gins on the market now. But I really wanted it to work in all the classic gin cocktails. So I was okay, well, the world doesn't need, I think this is the other thing too, just living in the capitalist matrix. If I'm going to make something, I really do want it to solve a problem for the customer, or I do really want it to be delightful. And the world doesn't need another London Dry gin, really, just because I'm a woman with a passion, so I was I want this to be unique but also versatile. And so I think it functions as a dry gin. It really works in all the classic gin cocktails. And as I was developing it, I was testing it in classic gin cocktails. But then I think this is kind of where artistry comes in, but I also wanted it to be compelling. I wanted it to work as a dry gin, but then also be intriguing to the customer. And that was sort of the thesis. So it wasn't it really wasn't gratuitous. I mean, I've definitely had like, nerdy cocktail bartenders who are like, well, that's too many botanicals. But, the funny thing is like, no, you can't really taste the Indonesian long pepper. It's not an Indonesian long pepper gin, but you can, it does really show up in heat and then on the back end. And if I took it out, it would taste differently. So, this could be unpopular opinion, but this was really sort of like the problem that I was trying to solve. And this was the approach I took. Was it a pain in the ass? Yes. But all those botanicals actually really serve a purpose. And I have tried taking them out and the gin tastes different.
I go back to there's no right number. And you've definitely heard it from people. I've heard it from people. You're absolutely right. You take out an ingredient and it tastes different.
Yeah.
It's not adding things to just add things. It's adding things to tell a story.
And then sometimes it's interesting because there are some botanicals or some ingredients that they're really not, they're doing something where they're almost creating space between the other botanicals, or they're doing something to, elongate the finish, for example. But like, it is kind of a hard thing to describe. So some of them, but that's certainly a concept in like perfumery again, or also, getting back to the science of flavor. Like there are some flavors that sort of, aren't, super evident, but they kind of pull things together in a nice way.
Absolutely. And I think of it a lot in like triangles where you're working with like a set of 3 ingredients, and that each ingredient kind of has a partner and a plus one.
Yeah,
totally. Working together and have a goal. And then you keep adding triangles.
Yeah, it is like, I think it's really, I mean, the other thing too is like, I mean, I don't want to sound pretentious or anything, but like there's how many instruments in a symphony? So there can be a 5-piece band, there can be a 3-piece, or there can be like 20 somethings, and they all kind of do something. Now that might be just sort of a function of making enough noise, or all those different types of instruments kind of work together to produce something.
Absolutely. It takes a lot of people and like an orchestra to, it sounds simplistic that they sound good, but to sound cohesive, to like be all on the same page. Like you can have an orchestra of 10 people or 50 people, but if they're cohesive and they work together, it's going to sound beautifully regardless.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I loved geeking out about botanicals because that's one of my favorite subjects. We've talked about a bunch, but I want to talk about like as one specific botanical that you get to pick. We talked about extractions very different between spirits and non-alcoholic. What is this one botanical that is lovely in spirits but terrible in NA?
Well, actually, juniper.
I believe that. Juniper water, I don't think is ever going to take off.
Juniper is just really challenging. It is interesting. I think junipers, there are certain ones that are just like much more challenging. I mean, a lot of them do cross over, but I find it really difficult to get a good juniper flavor in a. You don't get like the full spectrum of the juniper in a water extraction. So I find that's a tough. Unfortunately, that's a tough one because it's in a lot of gin, obviously. I mean, the funny. Want to know something funny? There are ingredients that the thing that bothers me is that we're dealing with the GRAS list, the TTB GRAS list, and I think it's just sort of a function of like when it was written. But then there are food products that aren't on that GRAS list that if the TTB officer doesn't want to look at the facts, then there's actually a lot more things that you can use in food products, strangely, than you can in distilled spirits.
Everyone has their story.
Start a similar
story here. Let's talk about something that you submitted that, if you would like to, if something that you submitted that was on the grass that was A-okay, if you went through it without like a second glance, or something that was surprising that got rejected.
Well, I have had formulas rejected where the botanicals are on the grass list, and they're like, well, that's also a medicinal plant, and it's like, well, but it's on the grass list. So sometimes it's like, oh, I'm trying to think of what botanicals. I'll say Cascara sagrada, for example. Like it is a supplement. It's generally used in much greater concentrations as a laxative, for lack, among other things, traditionally by the indigenous people. But it's on the grass list. It's on the TTB grass list. It's on there. But it was like, so what's actually happening right now, as I think alternative medicine is becoming more common, is I feel like the TTB is just like thinking, okay, well, this is a supplement. It can't go into a distilled spirit. Whereas like, if you get into the history of plant medicine and folk medicine, and probably every single botanical on the TTB grass, like juniper is, like they all have their medicinal properties. So where do we draw the line here? So AMASS, when I love mushrooms, I have a great, I do really believe in a lot of plant medicine. And one of the things that's helped me immensely, I had Lyme disease in my 20s, and one of the things that has immensely helped me, and I deeply believe in, are functional mushrooms. And so it was through my familiarity with functional mushrooms that I decided to put reishi mushroom and lion's mane mushroom in AMASS gin. So for years, AMASS gin was formulated with those two mushrooms, which are functional mushrooms, but certainly lion's mane is also consumed as a food. You can buy it at Whole Foods. They really don't have any side effects whatsoever. Reishi mushroom is really, generally speaking, taken for immunity. Lion's mane mushroom has incredible neurogenerative properties. It's like if I was left on a desert island, that's like probably the functional medicine I would want to have with me. But it's also a food. Like it's literally sold as like something you can like turn into a vegetarian steak at the grocery store. Well, eventually, after having this product in market for several years, the TTB was like, no, like actually you have to take these mushrooms out. And it was like a huge deal. And we had a big back and forth, and even just like getting into the actual, here, these are the active compounds in these mushrooms. Like I'm using them for their flavor properties. Lion's mane has, I think, an incredible umami flavor. Reishi mushroom is actually really interesting in that it's a little dank, but it's also quite bitter. So I was kind of using it for more of its bitter component. And I put mushrooms into AMASS because I always thought that mushrooms would be like an umami note would pair really well with the coniferous juniper notes of the juniper. And that was, that was kind of heartbreaking. But they just were, like really concerned that I was going to poison someone with a little bit of like lion's mane mushroom in the gin. So I eventually we did end up having to change the formula. So now we work with shiitakes and morels. And now I'm not sure if the TTP likes me very much, but I understand that their job is to kind of protect, it's a public health concern, but I personally, obviously I wouldn't ever make anything that I thought was not good for you. And guess what? Alcohol is not good for you.
And I think, first off, it is a bad business plan to want to hurt your consumer.
Yes, exactly.
And so none of us are trying to do that. I have never had the displeasure of having something basically recalled for something that was approved and then became unapproved.
Yeah.
Yeah, I I've heard a few cases of it happening, which is super unfortunate because you have, just from like a monetary standpoint, labels, bottles, inventory, all these things that you might not get to use. But also like the artist's soul is just a little crushed in that moment as well.
Yeah. I think there's that's like a bigger story right there where it's just like, okay, like when was the grass list written? Like what year? I think it was, I can't remember, but it was like over 50 years ago, I think. Has it ever been updated? And a big thing for me too is just, it's quite Eurocentric for obvious reasons. And for me, like one of the fun things ideologically that I think about like using these different plants is biodiversity. So it's a little arbitrary, but I'm sure if we were to peek under the hood of all sorts of other CFRs and other industries, it would be pretty arbitrary as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a great note to close on. For more than 30 years, G&D Chillers has had the proven solution for distilleries. Visit them today at gedchillers.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, go to spiritsanddistilling.com and sign up for our free newsletter featuring news stories every week from some of the best writers and distillers in the distilling world. Morgan, if people want to learn more or taste for themselves some of the results of the projects you've been working on, how can they find you?
Getting back to regulations, luckily with Dissois, we can sell direct to consumer online. So Dissois products can be found at www.drinkdissois.com. And then the AMASS spirits and, our home fragrance personal care line can be found at amass.com. We don't sell our spirits online, but we have pretty good distribution. And, work with some of the bigger online retailers, for example, Total, Aster, K&L. So our products can be found there as well. But, oh my goodness, Molly, thank you so much for bringing me on your show. Now I feel like I need to start a podcast so I can interview you.
Just let me know when. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another in-depth distilling conversation for you. Thanks for joining us. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Spirits and Distilling for those who love to make and drink great spirits. Join our free newsletter today at spiritsanddistilling.com for pragmatic, technical, and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Sign up now at spiritsanddistilling.com or click on the link in the show notes.